This is Eric Rutan of Cannibal Corpse. You are listening to the Scars and Guitars podcast with Andrew McKay Smith.
You've tuned in to my conversation with former Cradle of Filth keyboard player Greg Moffitt, aka Damien Gregori. Greg was a member of the band when they recorded The Empire and Dark Fairy Tales in Palestine, and one of the albums that broke the band worldwide, Dusk and Her Embrace, the 1996 edition, the one that features Stuart Anstis's guitar playing. The catalyst for the conversation with Greg is simply my curiosity. If you've been a long-time listener to the show, you will know that I'm trying to track down all of the important members of the band that were in the group throughout the 1990s, and Greg is certainly one of them, so it was fantastic to catch up with him and hear his testimony, his opinions on being a member of the band during that crucial period of their development. So here he is, Greg Moffitt, aka Damien Gregori, the one-time keyboard player in Cradle of Filth.
On the Paul interview, I had a fellow called Arthur hit me up from your part of the world, and I'm not sure whether he knows you or not, but he certainly said that he was aware that you worked at a church, or you had an association with a local church there. Hit me up on Instagram, and he sent to me an interview that you appeared on, which I think was the Metal Island podcast, and said, "Hey, look."
Oh, good. I was thinking of sending you that one because that's one of them. That's probably the best one I've done.
I'm glad I listened to it then, so I'm not going to ask you the same questions. There's a few triggers there, or catalysts as I call them, but I certainly won't be asking you the same questions because that's so people can listen to that interview if they want to dive into, your entry. And I guess the most interesting thing from that conversation was the catalyst for your exit. So I guess I'll lead with that because you said that Nick sacked you, or Nick was the person that said to you that he felt, or maybe the band felt, that you were holding them back, which Nick didn't mention that when I spoke to him, actually. Not that there's been so many members in Cradle, which of course I'll dive into throughout the conversation as well, but he didn't mention that. So I was surprised to hear that in some ways. But you also said something interesting, which Nick referred to, which was that the dynamic between Nick and Dani was often confrontational. Now, for you, looking back on your time in Cradle of Filth, which is unbelievably a quarter of a century ago, I feel old myself just saying that, if you can believe that it's that long ago. What do you think Nick meant by you holding them back?
I just think it was code for, when I say they, but, one or more people who decided that, something had to change. So it was code for just basically, you have to go because we know there's internal problems here. We don't really know how to fix it. So you see this in personal relationships, and people just make arbitrary changes in order to try and, roll the dice and see if that fixes it. Now, I'm not saying that I didn't clash with anyone else in the band. Everybody pretty much clashed with everybody else, apart from maybe me and Rob, because we just got on so well. But so I think holding them back was basically, unless somebody can come forward, Nick or Dani or anyone else, and after this amount of time, who really cares? But and actually articulate what was meant by that, because I don't really understand in what way I might have been doing that. I was doing what I was required to do. I was contributing. I was doing my best. So I think that, and you can see this throughout the whole history of the band. Different forms of internal tension, and something has to give. People leave, people are sacked, people are brought in. It works for a while, it doesn't work, people go. So I honestly think it was just a kind of a cipher, a code for, once again, we found ourselves with internal conflict. So what will we do this time? What do we normally do? We normally get rid of someone. It's this time it's going to be you. What conversations might have led up to that? I'm not privy to, obviously. And I think Nick was probably given the duty, because I always got on very well with Dani, and I'd imagine that he wouldn't have wanted to, even though he was there at the time, I'd imagine he wouldn't have wanted to be the one to say that, because he might not actually have felt that. So Nick was kind of like the enforcer, if you see what I mean, the heavy. Okay,
Sure.
so
Yep.
we gotta whack this guy. So you got the duty.
Yeah, it seems a bit heavy-handed in hindsight, particularly if yourself. I mean, you'd remember you were an adult at that stage. What the reasons possibly could have.
I can't say the same. Can't say the same for everybody in the band, but.
Yeah, look, that dynamic in that band. I've probably had more conversations with people in that band as a journalist, because I am a journalist, by the way. I've been to uni and got the qualifications, so I think I can say that. Effectively, I know most journalists aren't worth a goddamn thing these days, but most of them are bloody activists instead of truly curious about things. But I'm genuinely curious about Cradle of Filth because they're a band that I grew up with, and I've got to say I probably stopped listening to the band about 20 years ago, but it's an imprint. It's like Morbid Angel with me. Morbid Angel and Faith No More, Megadeth, Primus. There's a few bands, there's 5 or 6 bands, Aussie, where it's the stuff that I listened to as a teenager growing up in the mid-90s when hardly anybody listened to heavy metal back then. Certainly nobody I knew. I was sort of isolated and listened to it all by myself. So I could form my own views about things. And you guys, to me, were like superheroes. I had a big poster of, you were in it actually, a big poster of this topless girl. I don't know whether you remember it. It came with the Dusk vinyl. And it was this beautiful topless girl surrounded by you guys looking intensely evil. Do you remember that photo shoot in particular?
Oh, yeah, vividly, of course. Yeah, so I remember most things about that time vividly. And, that was I think it was a limited edition poster and it folded out, yeah.
Correct.
So, there was one photo shoot that we did for the album, which lasted a whole day, basically down in London, and that was one of the setups we had was that banqueting table. So yeah, I remember it clearly.
Yes, great picture. I had it for a long time, and of course I got that vinyl back in '96 or something like that. So it might have been a bit later. Either way, it was certainly in the mid '90s. But of course, I've lost that picture. But it's the one thing I wish I'd kept. Actually, from back in those days, God knows, it hung on my wall. It hung on some share houses that I lived in. Sometimes it was the only poster that I had up. But you guys, to me, just look like the archetypal black metal band. You just had you had a look going on, and I could tell you guys weren't Scandinavian too. And of course, I love all of the Scandinavian metal bands. I more or less think, it's a broader topic for me to dive into. But that if it wasn't for Scandinavians, I don't know whether metal would have resurged had the resurgence in the early 2000s. And it was really truly left to you guys in the late 90s there after Sepultura sort of broke apart and Pantera sadly splintered. It was Cradle and Strapping Young Lad. People forget that, actually, that it was you guys on Dusk and Strapping Young Lad with City in 1996 and 1997 that were the high watermark, because I don't truly count Fear Factory in a part of that. I just don't think it connected with metal fans the way City was from Strapping and Dusk did for you. But you must feel a sense of pride when you look back on that album, because you mentioned that you felt that it would be in the top 100 metal albums released maybe in the 90s or ever, but I certainly think ever, maybe in the top 10 actually. So do you have fond memories of the recording sessions and when the album was released and seeing its success?
Well, yeah, very much so. As with everything, with speaking personally, my time in the band, it's always tinged with, some slight regret and, what could have been sort of thing. And people might think, oh, what do you mean? So many people over the years have had so many amazingly complimentary things to say about Dusk and Embrace. But when you're on the inside of it, you could just see how, not maybe that the finished album could have been better, but just, and this is talking more widely, but, what the band could have achieved. And you could maybe say that about every band, because all bands peak at some point, and it's at best they're hit and miss. This is all your favorite bands. So you, me, everybody listening to this, all your favorite bands are hit and miss. By definition, bands can't keep getting better and better. Otherwise, at some point, they just become the best band in the universe, and no band will ever do anything better ever again. So, yeah, immensely proud of the album. The recording process had a lot of highs. It also had a lot of lows. But at the end of it, we were probably about as unified. That particular lineup was probably about as unified as we ever were when the album was finished and we were getting ready to tour, because everybody was so stoked and so pumped by what we'd come out with. And I will just throw in here, of course, and I've pointed this out I'm sure all Cradle fans are well aware of this, but most of the material for Dusk was already there by the time that the lineup for Vampire came together, which was then completed with the addition of John for Dusk and Her Embrace. So we were working with songs, the structures of which, and most of it was already there. Now, we did our own versions of those songs, and there is new material on the album that the first album lineup did not work on. But I or anyone else who came into the band later, we're not trying to take credit for a lot of those songs. But if you can listen to the original versions were later dusted down and overhauled, as I'm sure you're aware. The original Dusk and Embrace sessions, they were subsequently released. Now they've been heavily modified to make them sound as good as possible. And I checked that album out. I had to. I was so curious. But I think, as much as a hardcore fan would appreciate getting to hear that material, I think it highlights some of the areas where we managed to improve upon it, if you see what I mean. And we were improving upon the bones of very, very good songs.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a couple of points there I want to address, because I've since gotten to know Paul, and I've certainly underplayed I've not understood his contribution, but that has since changed. And he did write the majority of the music on Dusk, as Stuart wrote the majority of the music. Certainly he had Nick and your successor, Les, to help him out with Cruelty. But without Paul, the album doesn't get done. But what Stuart did, and I've had a 4-hour conversation with Stuart about this, but I distinctly remember I already had In the Nightside Eclipse, and I had Blizzard Beasts, of course, by Emperor and Immortal. When I heard Stuart's guitar playing on Dusk, that was the first time I'd heard Cradle. And then, of course, I went back and got Principle. But the point is, when I heard Stuart's guitar playing, it absolutely demystified black metal for me. And, of course, your keyboard playing too, the vastness of it all, and the tones and the type of effects that you decided to use. Because I assume, I'll ask you in a sec about that in terms of how you approach the songwriting on that one there. But before I go any further, you mentioned something. You said that when you were recording Dusk, that there were some lows. Can you tell me about some of them?
Well, it was all the usual stuff that I spotted within, because I was originally when I'd put myself forward to join the band. Their road manager, sound engineer at the time, they were a much smaller unit in terms of having a crew. He drove up north, picked me up, drove me down. I had a meeting with the band. It was then agreed that I'd come down again in a couple of weeks. I can't remember what the time period was, but quite soon. And I'd bring my equipment down. We'd have a rehearsal. So at that time, when we got together, I immediately spotted tensions. I was kind of like, oh, okay, so these guys are like bickering like an old couple. Mm-hmm. Even though there's more than two of them, not all the time and not with everybody, but you just noticed. And I thought, okay, well, I've been in bands before. I know how these things work. So when I mentioned that sort of dynamic happening during the recordings of Dusk, it was the usual stuff. It was people disagreeing over what I saw as petty stuff, not perhaps handling differences of opinion in a very mature way. And sometimes I'll hear people say, but you were young. Listen, what age was I? I was older than any of the other guys at the time, but even then I was like 25, 26, and the others were 2-3 years younger, various ages. We're all adults, In the time between then and now, young people, have become ever more infantilized to the point where you've got like people, 35-year-old guys living in their parents' basement, just failure to launch types, But there's no reason why things couldn't have been conducted better, you know what I mean? So it was a great experience. We all really enjoyed what was coming out of those big speakers in the studio. But there was just all this little low-level stuff that I just wish hadn't been there, because I would love it to have been was just us like a gang us against the world, like a team. You know, I mean, I'm not expecting it all to be just a bed of roses. You know, there's a lot of pressure in the studio like that. We ended up spending 10 weeks in the studio, which was considerably longer than we had booked originally and budgeted for. The label went with it because they could hear what we were doing. They knew it was going to be good. But that was 10 weeks in the studio. While we were doing this is in Birmingham, in UB40 studio. And we're living in this shitty hotel, this shitty hotel. I can't tell you how bad this hotel was. And so we're there all the time, you know, so we're there all together all the time. And as much as I mentioned, you know, being like a gang and enjoying our time together, we couldn't get away from each other as well. So I think that was a bit of a pressure pot. And we were all under a lot of pressure to get this done as quickly as possible. But I just wish that when things bubbled to the surface, that we could either have had a bit of a timeout, one or more of us, or that we could have handled things a little bit better. But again, you then think of bands of whatever genre in, you know, at the twilight of their career, arguing like spoilt brats over royalties and who did what. And, you know, it's just, I used to think when I was a kid that I'd look at other kids in the playground fighting over stupid shit. And I'd think, oh, well, you know, adults, obviously when you're an adult, you don't behave like this because adults know what's going on. They've got their shit sorted out. And then I realized later on, when I was a teenager, adults haven't necessarily got it sorted out at all. People basically are children from cradle to grave.
That is so true. I'm so glad you said that. I'm just forming that view. Kind of already known it, but I think it's just because I'm in my mid-40s and I've been alive long enough to see that many people just don't improve. They're fucking morons from when they were 13 to when they are now. Excuse my language, but you know what I'm saying. It's ridiculous. You see that in politics, for example, and you see the way individuals react to politics. It's like they're following a rugby league side or something, or a soccer team, I suppose, in your parlance, you know, or football team, sorry, where they pick a team early on and they just stick with it, come hell or high water. And they don't take on board any new data and adjust their behaviour. No, that's it. We become, and you could apply this to music taste as well. We become very set in our ways very early on, and it's when new information is presented, you know, it is okay to change your mind or to adjust. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't keep like a red line running all the way through your life in fact, it's good to, you know, of like integrity and what's important to you, values, morals, anything that guides you in life. But it's just this complete blinkered attitude of failing to take into, you know, account anything that's changing around you. And of course, that's why a lot of us are struggling at the minute, is because we're living in a world that's changing at an increasingly rapid pace. And people are obviously struggling massively to cope with it. So, you know. Howard, I do want to talk to you about legalised freedom because I've listened to many episodes and I'm extremely impressed, I've got to say. Your work reminds me of Lex Fridman a little bit, who I think is doing magnificent work, but I'll get to that a bit later on. I just want to stick with the cradle thing for now because the one question that I haven't asked anybody that was a member of the Dusk lineup, but I get the opportunity to talk about now, is Kit Woolven. Now, I touched on it with Stuart, but he's magnificent. And to your point earlier about, and I've always said this, and it's absolutely no disrespect to Paul at all, but they're like night and day, those two recordings. Meaning I just call it the Paul version and the Stuart version. That's in my parlance. That's what I've decided to call them for the conversations that I'm doing. I could call it the Greg version too, if you like, because of course you recorded on it. But they are night and day, and they almost sound like different recordings. Now, working with Kit, you're working with one of the best in the business as far as me as a fan can see. But was that your take? And can you tell me about how you worked with him on the keyboard sound? Because I had a shitty little car back in the day, man, but your keyboards on that album on the CD just soared. They were beautiful.
Well, thank you. It was easy working with Kit. I'll just throw in a little nugget of information here. People maybe go back. I can't remember what it says on the Dusk credits now, but the engineer at the time working with Kit was Dan Sprigg. And although Kit recorded a lot of keyboards with me, in the basement, they had a second studio, and especially when we were under more and more time pressure, I did go downstairs with Dan, just he and I, and work on textures and sound effects and stuff, because they had that, that second studio down there. And so while the guys would work upstairs on the guitars in the big room. So I just want to give some credit there, that we were doing several things at once. Working with Kit was super easy, I found. He was a cliched, and I mean that in the nicest possible way, old school producer, the generation that he was, his background and stuff, having worked with Thin Lizzy and UFO and whatnot. People can look up his credits. Now, my recollection is that he, of course, was married to the band's manager at the time.
Correct. Yeah.
Faye Woolven. I think she still looks after the band. In fact, I know she does. So there may have been, you'll put two and two together and into how he might have come into the situation. But anyway, his name was put forward. I don't remember being invited to comment on it, but anyway, it was you're going to be working with this guy. Here's his credits. And he was consummate professional. Always had a can of Stella Artois lager on the desk as he worked. just keep things flowing.
Oh, yeah.
And he was a cultured guy as well. Now, the interesting thing was having him there kind of threw up a little bit of the differences between how members of the band work together and work with other people, because Dani and I got on very well with Kit. We could talk about similar things, and I feel that Nick, for example, him and Kit didn't really have much in common. So, there wasn't the same kind of bon homie, if you want to put it that way, there. And also bear in mind that Nick did not have to re-record the drums. So the drums that you hear on the 96 version are the same drums that he recorded for the original one.
Yep.
All that Kit did in the studio was basically take the raw recordings, and make them sound massive. So the decision was taken to save money not to re-record the drums. The reason I mention this is because Nick did not have to work one-on-one with Kit, recording a whole album's worth of very complex, very fast drums. If he had, they may have built up more of a working relationship. So a lot of the time when Nick was there, he was kind of at the back of the control room, or hanging around, offering his opinion, whatever. But he was at a bit of a loose end some of the time. Excuse me.
Yeah, okay. So Dan Sprigg, is that the name of the engineer that you mentioned? I should know this, but okay.
Dan Sprigg. Yeah, you can look him up. He's since gone on to be a very successful producer in his own right.
Okay, there you go. Would you say that the sound that was captured was more to do with your relationship, or your working relationship with him, as opposed to Kit, or was it more that you did what you had to do with Dan, and then Kit just came in and just tweaked a few things, and there you go?
No, the first keyboards I remember recording were in the main control room with Kit, but Dan was there as well. He was engineer. That was the whole point, because the studio was massive, and there was lots of things to do. There was more than enough for two guys at the desk to be, twiddling knobs and adjusting things. But it was when we started to come under more time pressure that the decision was made. Okay, well, why don't you've got this, you're working on this keyboard instrumental, or you need to do these graveyard sound effects. We're going to carry on with guitars and vocals. You and Dan head off and do this. So that was just a practical thing, I think, at some point, in order to try and expedite the process. Because as I say, although we spent 10 weeks, we still only just got finished in time. I remember at the end of the process, the studio giving everybody in the band and our crew and involved a bottle of really good champagne. And I remember thinking, well, that's nice, but I'd rather have had a discount off the cost of the studio, because they're giving us champagne, because they're going, I can't believe these guys have been here for like 2.5 months at the rates we're charging,
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah. What were your recollections about working? Could you call it that? Working with or working for the label Music for Nations? Because I know all about what happened with Cacophonous Records there, and of course that is part of the reason why Dusk was re-recorded. But did they get involved at all, or did they just advance you guys the money and say, make the album of your lives, guys?
No, Music for Nations at that time were a label that we wanted to be signed to, because they had either signed or licensed so many of the albums during the 80s that were important to all of us. You know, releasing all the Metallica albums in the UK and so many other, mainly thrash metal bands, but other subgenres as well. So they were a label that we had in mind, and we wanted to sign with a British label if possible. When we were looking for a new deal, I never actually signed with Cacophonous personally, but when the band collectively was looking for a new deal, when we're trying to get out of that situation, Music for Nations were top of the list for the reason I just mentioned, and others. There were we went across and had negotiations with Nuclear Blast, for example, in Germany. Mm-hmm. They were a great label. They treated us very well. They made a really good offer, and it was very tempting. But we actually sort of haggled with Music for Nations and more or less said, look, you want us. And by the way, we want you. So it's kind of a bit of a mutual thing going on, sort of giving them something if they give us something. So to directly answer your question, it was a good relationship. They did what we wanted a label to do, which was put the proper resources in to make the product that we had in mind. So, with artwork, they spent money on the photographers, the two different photographers whose work went together to make the front sleeve, the packaging, special editions, and not least of which was this 10-week recording. They invested the money. They knew it was going to be good. And I remember having many meetings with Music for Nations at their offices, which at the time were at Latimer Road in London. And they treated us well. So we were pleased to be with the label, and they looked like they were pleased to sign us. So it was a good situation. And obviously the band continued with Music for Nations sometime after that. And I can't comment there, but I think overall it will be regarded as fruitful. In fact, the poster you mentioned at the start, a lot of labels were going, I don't know, it's going to cost too much, But they knew it was like, no, if we're going to do this, do it right. Don't do some kind of halfway house. And I think it paid off.
Magnificently so, I must say. And look, I've got to touch on this topic because of the response that I get to the episode with Stuart. Because I think, of course, as I mentioned, Dusk is a seminal album in its own right. And it's easily one of my most listened to albums ever. I must have listened to it, if not 1,000 times, it'd be approaching that. But I long felt, and I say this with the greatest of respect, that Cruelty seemed to take it up a notch. I know it wasn't recorded to the musicians in the band at the time liking, but I've had a long and in-depth conversation with Stuart and Nick about this. But I know that he recorded all of the guitars, of course. John wasn't. He was a member he was just a named member, but he didn't actually do anything in the studio. Certainly that's been confirmed by Nick and by Stuart. So Stuart did
which album?
Dusk, that is. Dusk, and the majority, I think, too, of Cruelty as well, I must say.
John was certainly there during the recording because when he first came down to join the band, he came to Birmingham because I remember we went to New Street Station to meet him. So he was certainly there. But anyway, that's kind of by the by.
Yeah. But what were your impressions of Stuart?
Okay, so I would say he was someone I didn't have much in common with. We would never have hung out if we were not in a band together, and we didn't hang out much when we were in the band. I didn't not get on with him, but he was just not someone. He was like a stoner. That was his background. When he first came to audition for the band, I remember and there's no disrespect to the guy. It's just everybody's got their own look. But I remember Dani sort of just saying, he looks like a tramp, or words to that effect. So he came in a big overcoat, and his hair was in a state. And, he was like smoking a joint or smoking a cigarette. He didn't look like the guy who was going to be in the band. Now, of course, he then, as everyone was required to, most band members wanted to, but then you overhaul your image. You do your version of what you think, okay, I'm in this band now. We're very image conscious. We've got to do something about that. So, but that's not really, to answer your question again, I got on very well with John. He was very garrulous. He was just non-stop energy, a lot of fun. It could be a bit over the top at times, so after a while it'd be like, okay, John, I'm going to go home now. But,
we've all got one of those mates, mates, yeah.
But, again, the simplest way to put it is that I guess that if I hadn't been in the band with Stuart, I doubt our paths would ever have crossed. Whereas I was already aware of John because of Solstice, New Dark Age.
Yeah.
So I became aware of that when I was in Cradle, and Dani at the time lived in a village in Suffolk called Hadley. So I'd go and visit him at home sometimes, and also in Hadley at the time was Misanthropy Records, run by Tiziana Stupia. And, and we all know the great history of that label. But so Solstice New Dark Age came to my attention at that time, and the other guys in Cradle were fans of that album as well. So that might have been something to do with getting John in the band. I'm not sure. But anyway, so I was already aware of him and his work, if you see what I mean. So when he came down to try out for the band, it was kind of, oh yeah, it's the guy from Solstice.
Okay, there you go. That's, how can I put that? That's interesting to hear, because your musical partnership is very fruitful. Yours and Stuart's I'm talking about. You blend on record is what I'm saying, and that doesn't always happen. Listen to some of those Megadeth records and the like, or some of those musicians who are top guns in their field. But, Jimmy DeGrasso, for example, with Dave Mustaine, never truly gelled for me as a listener, going from Nick and then God knows whoever else Dave's had in the band afterwards. But you guys, you might have been chalk and cheese, and that's my interpretation of what you're saying, but you certainly had a fruitful musical partnership.
Well, that was probably made possible because I don't know. You can hear what we might have done on if I'd played on Cruelty and the Beast. If you go back to Vampire, because there was new material on Vampire, which we cooked up, and Stuart was the only guitarist at the time, despite what the finished record, would lead you to believe. There's only, and I played the keys. Everything was much more basic in a much smaller studio. So where I'm going with this is that on Dusk and Embrace, we were working mostly with material that was already there. Although I was able to rework keyboards to my own. I followed what Ben Ryan had done up to a point, like, okay, but in some of it was like we couldn't do anything else, but I expanded upon it a great deal. So, and Stuart was playing a lot of guitar parts that were already laid down, already written. So I don't know what our quote unquote working relationship might have been like if I'd stayed in the band for the writing of Cruelty. And I like to think it would have been fine because, we didn't argue or anything like that, but equally, I used to go round to Robin's like flat all the time just to hang out, but we would write and record loads and loads of little cassettes of ideas. I never ever did that with Stuart even once. I can't imagine doing that. If we'd been writing, it would have been in the rehearsal studio. So who knows what that would have been like if we hadn't had the scaffolding of Dusk and Embrace that was already in place.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, it's a great explanation too, by the way. It answers, I get hit up a lot about the episode with Stuart, and certainly recently wasn't the first time I've been asked to bring you onto the show, but it certainly answers some of the, it satisfies my curiosity, if you like, about the working relationship or otherwise. But I need to ask, talking to Nick, he called John Blackie useless and said Rob couldn't tie his shoelaces. Tough but fair, do you think?
I I know why he said that, and I've heard Blackie Useless before. Rob not being able to tie his own shoelaces, I think is a bit unfair. But again, I know why he might say that. Rob is very quiet, but he wrote a hell of a lot that was never really, how shall I put it, properly entertained, properly considered, because he wasn't a very, he wouldn't push himself forward with his stuff. You know, he'd have all these mountains of material, which he'd play to me in his flat. And I, this is great. He says, oh yeah, you know, but I'm not sure. And I said, no, you know, put it forward. And then it'd be like, oh yeah, have you got anything, Rob, in the rehearsal studio? Nick would say, sitting behind the kit, have you got anything, Rob? Yeah, I got this, you know, and be like, yeah, okay. Anyone else got anything? You know what I mean? And I'd be like, oh, why don't we consider this? I remember an example is like one riff in particular that Rob played and I put keyboards on. I thought, we've got a single here. This is the next The Forest Whispers My Name, you know, not the band did singles, but I thought perhaps we should have considered it.
Yeah.
And so Rob and I did he had a little drum machine. So we did a little demo of it, a little instrumental demo, played it. I think we were around at Stuart's flat actually in Hadley at the time. And Stuart said, sounds too much like Satyricon. And that was the end of it. You know, that was it. Gone. Okay. You know.
Yes, and after all this conversation, the one person that we haven't talked a lot about is Dani. So I've got a bit of a monologue here, so bear with me as I go through it. But in addition to the members that I've already spoken to, I have spoken to Dani, Lindsay Schoolcraft, Richard Shaw, who's currently in the band, and I've hit Sarah up on Instagram as well. So there are 26 band members, I believe, certainly what I can find, that are credited as actual members in album booklets that have left the band. Overall, there have been 40 band members that have been both studio contributors and live members. And that's spread across vocals, bass, guitar, drums, and of course keyboards. And there's a bunch of other, you know, Kronos from Venom did some spoken word stuff, but I'm not including them. Now, if you were running a business and if a band member is akin to having a seat on a board, shareholders would probably question the validity of the business given the cycling here. So I know we're talking about music and it's vastly different to running a traditional business like a retail outlet or a swimming pool cleaning business or what have you, because there are extended tours and also with musicians, because I'm one too, so I get it. God knows I've been in enough bands and none of them have worked out, so I can write my own book about some of these things too, but quite possibly a lot of sensitive personalities as well. But look, you were one in the band. You are one of the 26 credited actual members. So you do have, and you've given me some great insight on the band's dynamic overall so far. So I truly appreciate that. But do you have a clue as to why Cradle cycles 3 members about as often as I have cases of beer over the years? Because there is, I've got to come out with it. It just seems like Dani runs the band as a Napoleon character and people just sort of come in and out.
Well, I think that's the bottom line. I don't think that Dani, I can't imagine from the time I did spend with him and talk with him, that's ever how I'd have wanted it to be. I don't think he's, certainly in the early days, I think the original Cradle, I know there was various people, before the lineup that you hear on Principle of Evil Made Flesh isn't the first lineup, but when the band first came together, I think they were just like every other group of teenagers, fired up with metal, wanting to do their own thing. So I don't think that was ever Dani's vision or intention. And I think that whatever happened with the band when they split in half, you know, after Principle came out, I think that was a big blow. And I think that the guys who left, you know, when Paul Allender and the Ryans left, they basically, well, one or more of them, the attitude, maybe from the Ryans more than anything else, the attitude was like, fuck you, Dani, you haven't got a band anymore. And Dani's always been focused and determined. He's a very forceful character. And it was clear when I spoke with him, when my name was, you know, in the frame for joining the band, that he was determined to put Cradle of Filth back together as quickly as possible and do something better than they'd already done. because he knew the band had some momentum already in the underground. So Vampire came together, but it wasn't all there yet. And then Dusk came together, and I think at that point, especially given that the band went professional at that point, when Dusk was released, that's when people stopped having day jobs, because you could do that back then. Hey kids, between the time when Dusk was released and Christmas, we sold about 100,000 albums, in a few months, physical copies, plus all the merchandise. And the band's always sold when I was in, the ratio of merchandise to album sales was about 10-1. So for every album we'd sell 10 merch items. So it was pretty lucrative, but it was still, mid-range. But so anyway, we went professional at that point, and that was seen as kind of, okay, we're on our way now. So I can only guess that the band was always Dani's vision, but he doesn't write music, so he always needed people around him, as most like band leaders and people who, like Dave Mustaine, you gave the example, people who have a vision, they need the right people around them. And I suppose as time went on, I'm guessing, you'd have to ask Dani this, but he wanted to keep his band going, his vision going. And I think he wanted a band. I really think he wanted a unified band, not hired hands or anything like that. But I do remember, well, when I was in the band, and I know this could be a sensitive subject, but I've never signed any clauses to say that I can't speak about this, otherwise I wouldn't be here. Let's just put it this way, without putting too fine a point on it. When I was in the band, it was an equal split. At some point after that, maybe quite a while after that, but at some point after that, that changed, and that inevitably changes the dynamic. It becomes not 6 equal partners. It becomes boss and employees, or whatever, however you want to put it. And that's bound to change things in ways that are, if not imperceptible, then maybe beyond just pure music. Then you're starting to think about, finances and everything else. And how many bands can we think of that have hit roadblocks or fallen apart, for financial reasons? It's kind of sad, but, that money makes the world go round. It can also make it stop.
My suspicion is you're absolutely on point. And I think that's potentially, gosh, I'm kind of limited as to what I can say because of the insight I've been given. Okay, but I'm simply going to say my suspicion is you're absolutely on point. And I don't even think the band has a keyboard player at the moment. I think Marek, or Martin, as he goes by the English version of Marek, I think he does the keyboards at this point in time. I think they just put them through the PA or whatever when they're playing, which is... Look, I could be wrong about that at the moment, but certainly when I look at Wikipedia, it's not listing, and also the most recent band photos, I'm pretty sure there's I think there's only 5 members instead of 6, all right, saying that, at the moment. So people have to feel included and involved. Stuart mentioned that to me, that he made sure that, or worse the effect, I'm paraphrasing him here, that he made sure, even though John didn't do the writing on Cruelty or didn't play on Dusk, he made sure that he was included as a member in the way you've just described, and certainly given credit on the albums. So once that shifts, and God knows I've been in enough bands, as I've mentioned already myself, once that shifts and you're seeing power centralise in one place, particularly in a black metal band where the chances of success were slim to none to begin with, but when you get to the top of the pile, like what Cradle of Filth managed, and I'm not defending Dani here, and one day I will talk to him about these things if he ever wants to talk to me, but I can understand how you can develop a Napoleon complex and think you're always right and that you're in charge and you're boss. I can understand how that happens. The issue, though, is that, and again, I'm bound by... it's not confidentiality. People have shared things with me that they've asked me not to share, but I know some of the behind-the-scenes things that went on in the band, and it's not good. It's not good at all. And I worry about... I worry about the mental health of some people that have been in the band as a human being, because I'm a parent myself, and that's where I get a bit concerned. See, I'm a fan, obviously, and I'm only looking at the outside in, but as a journalist, I start asking questions, and the more I dig, to be honest with you, with this band, it just keeps on going fucking deeper. and I begin to think joining this band could potentially be, it could be damaging to your health in some ways. Now, that's my opinion, okay? So I'm entitled to say that as a fan. I'm not saying I'm basing that on any data whatsoever. That's my interpretation and my perception of what I see with this band here. But to go through that many band members, as I said, 40 tenured band members live or in the studio, 26 that have been credited, of a band that's been in the spotlight as long as what Cradle has been, no other band has been through that many band members that I'm aware of, okay? You look at bands like Satyricon have always been, you mentioned them, okay, so that's always been Frost and Sartor's thing, and they just bring in people around them. I've spoken to Sartor, and to me, he just seems like a very cultured, and he's like you, man. He reminds me of you a bit. He's a Renaissance man. He's just a guy who likes fine living and culture. And so when I spoke to him, I got the impression that you knew what you were going to get when you worked with him and Frost. If you sign up to go on a tour or whatever, you're just in the band for the tour, put on the face paint or the corpse paint, I should say, and get up on stage, do your thing, and sort of go. But because Sigurd, as his name is, because Sartor writes the music in that band and Dani doesn't write the music in Cradle of Filth, and that's the key distinction right there, my perception is that musicians are being used to further his career. What do you think about that as a comment?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to say that even if that's not the intention, then that's the reality. He might not express it like that further his career, but that's what it actually is, because without, he could have a career doing something else, TV personality or something, DJ, I don't know. But if the front man with Cradle of Filth, and he needs musicians and he needs music, so yeah, just by default, of course, he doesn't have a career without that, and you can bring in hired hands, or call them band members if you want, and they can play your back catalogue. Some of them may play your back catalogue better than the guys who wrote or recorded it. But when it comes down to writing, and this is one of the things that I'm sure all of us can think of with the bands that we've been fans of long term, when new people come in and the writing changes, that can be sometimes for the better, quite often not really. I'd say most times not. And that's not to take, that doesn't mean that the new writing or the slightly new revised version of a band won't find fans elsewhere, that someone else won't think this new version of the band is the best. No doubt there are. I mean, I've spoken to Cradle fans. I remember speaking to a few of them at Bloodstock here in the UK in 2019 when Cradle played, and they were kind of like, "Oh yeah, we don't. This is like, there are some songs up there, from like the early 90s we don't really know. I'm gonna have to check out that early Cradle stuff." And they're stood there in front of me with that Cradle shirt on and like, their attempt at corpse paint. I'm old enough to be their father, sort of thing. You say, "Oh, okay, yeah, you really should check that stuff out." But yeah, so that's to further his career, yes, by definition, by default, and that's bound to alter the music, because if you then say, and this is, so many bands have gone wrong here. So okay, this is the new lineup of the band. Can you listen to these albums that were really successful and do something like that? That's a mission to nowhere, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, it's just so strange with that band, because with Dani only coming in to help out with the arrangements, because I've spoken to so many members, I can triangulate, I think, what actually occurs because I've got all this data. So the musicians write the music, they invite Dani in. Certainly Richard Shaw gave me a great insight as to how the band's music is written. He actually told me that he'd been in the band, whatever the time period was, it was a rather short period of time. He was writing a Cradle album, and he had to actually talk to his brother, who was a massive Cradle fan, about what Cradle of Filth fans might want to hear. To give you an idea, that's the dynamic that existed in the band. And I've got to say, both he and Lindsay sounded like lovely people, but they were nowhere near as candid about the things that you're talking about, or Stuart, or any of the other members that have left the band. So Lindsay, since she's left, I'd love to talk to her and compare the two conversations, because she described Dani as broader. There's a broader quote, but in the quote, the boss man. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Because he's not writing the music. He might have the relationships with the management, but what that then suggested to me, and this is the core issue, I think, in the band at the moment, and probably underlines some of the other stuff that we've been talking about, is that Dani's the only tenured member, and everybody else, a bit like what happens in Megadeth at the moment, they're just on the payroll. You're just in the band for that period of time, a bit like what I imagine goes on in Kiss. So that's not necessarily, like, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Like, there's obviously utility in that because the band can keep on going. But fans don't know these things, and they don't understand that people are adults and they're trying to pay mortgages and rents, and potentially if they've got children, they've got to put kids through school. You've got to put food on the table is what I'm saying. So individuals can quite often, without realising it, and I'm definitely not saying Dani does this, but you can enter into a situation with great intention, and your perception the perception could be with a lot of these band members, after a period of time, they've been taken advantage of. And then they just pop out the other side of it, and then they're upset. And the other thing is, not a lot of band members pop up in other bands afterwards. So out of the 26 tenured members, how many have gone on to have done what Dave Mustaine did? Let's just use him, for example. These are the guys and girls that are writing the music. So that's interesting. I don't think I'll ever get an answer to that. Maybe they just don't want to do it anymore. Maybe they're burnt out. Maybe it's just been such a bad taste that's been in their mouth that they say, this music industry stuff is just shit. And I've got to tell you, I know I couldn't do it either. Speaking after, almost well over 600 interviews at this point, I don't think I could tour the world and smell other people's farts for as long as what people need to on those bloody awful tour buses across the Midwest of the USA, and sitting around. I mean, most musicians, to underline a point, are professional travellers. You spend about an hour and a half to 2 hours on stage, unless you're Paul McCartney, then it's 4 hours. I suffered through one of his concerts once. But yeah, sorry, I've gone in a few different directions there. But I thought you were a good person to bring a lot of this stuff up with, because it had been a long time since you'd been in the band, and you've been successful in your own right since, but doing other things. So, but I will underline all of that with a question, which is based on a point that I raised there, which is that I don't think I saw your name, and it might have been the case, so please correct me if I'm wrong, in other bands since you left Cradle. But why didn't you decide to extend your career in the music business with another band, or start your own after you left?
I just didn't want to. Bear in mind that I didn't have a band together when I joined Cradle. It wasn't long after I left university that the opportunity to join the band came up. And I was living in England at the time. That's where I went to university. And I had done a music technology master's degree, and wanted to get into that area, but found myself after a few months at a bit of a loose end. But I was thinking, we'll keep going. But I said to myself, I might move back to Ireland this is 1995. I might move back to Ireland by the end of the year if nothing comes up here. Now, in hindsight, that would have been a pointless move, but that's what I was thinking. I remember just sitting in the centre of town on a water fountain one day. It was the middle of the summer, a nice day, just contemplating life, the universe, and everything. So I thought, this is what I might do. And I wasn't in a band. And then I went and bought, for something to read, I went to the newsagents and bought a copy of Metal Hammer, and went back to the fountain and sat down to read that. And it was in there that I noticed this advertisement. Went to the classifieds at the back, and it said, name British black metal band require keyboard player, and there was just an address or a PO box to apply. And it was so unusual for, at that time, I was aware of the early Scandinavian black metal bands, some of which had keys, and it was just unusual at the time. Keyboards and metal wasn't really so much of a thing, and I'd been playing keyboards for a few years, and not bringing that together with metal, not at all. I was interested in the electronic music, particularly of the 70s, like Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schulze. So I've been doing that sort of style. But I thought, what the hell, I'll go for it. So, lo and behold, it worked out. the point being, I didn't have a band at that time. I wasn't trying to form a band. I wasn't thinking like that at all. I was just making music on my own. So when the Cradle thing came to an end, one thing I'd been doing prior, I started doing this at the end of the 80s, but I'd got my first few writing gigs, paying jobs, writing features for magazines and doing reviews of albums. So the first thing I did when the Cradle thing ended was pick that back up again. I called Nick Terry, who was the editor at that time. This is 97 now when I left the band, of the British metal magazine called Terrorizer.
Brilliant magazine. And I've read your work in that, by the way. You're a great writer, by the way. I just sort of want to put that in.
Thank you very much. Well, it was in its day. And Cradle had a particularly good relationship with Terrorizer, symbiotic. Like, we gave them exclusives and they put us on the cover. So that was good. And I called him up and literally just said, look, have you got any work? And he said, as it happens, we do. So to answer your question, I didn't have any urge to particularly get back into a band or anything like that. It did cross my mind because I thought, okay, that was an exciting time. There was a lot to like about that. But the way I look at it is because I played guitar as well. It was the first thing I ever played. I had bands, at school. Used to play at a school disco, that type of thing, and a few pubs and whatnot. But as much as music was the central thing in my life, being in a band, being up on a stage was never the most important thing. That's not really what it was about for whatever reason. Some guys just want to be in bands, whatever happens.
Yeah.
They'll play. They'll play in bands that are not maybe even their 100% their thing because they just want to be in a band. They want to be rehearsing. They want to be on stage. That's what they get a buzz out of. So, and I felt quite relieved, to be honest. It was a real weight off my shoulders and a weight off my mind. I remember clearly because the guys came round to my flat in Ipswich to break the news to me, and when they all left. I remember just sitting. It was the afternoon. I just sat down on the sofa, and I was like, okay, right. And I actually felt good, not like as in punching the air, because it was out of the blue, was not expecting it. But part of me was like, thank God for that, And that's not to take anything away from the experience at all. I wouldn't change a thing really, because you can't anyway. But it was a wild ride. I loved every minute of it, apart from the bits I didn't. But so forming another band never really crossed my mind. I had a couple of approaches. Like I remember getting an email from November's Doom over in the US, and would you be interested? Would you be interested in playing keys, sort of thing? And I spoke with the guys in My Dying Bride around when they were putting the band back together around 99 and looking at starting to play live shows again. Would I be interested in that? And that was a band whose music I adore, and that probably would have suited my personality a lot more. But nothing came of that. So there were just little bits and pieces, but no, I was happy not to be honest.
Yeah, I can see you would have fitted in with the guys in Paradise Lost. I've had a couple of conversations with those guys. Yeah, sorry, My Dying Bride. Sorry, both bands, I've got to say, and they both have impressed me immensely. They both. I
love Paradise Lost as well. Paradise Lost are one of my favorite bands of all time. So. Yeah.
Oh, but My Dying Bride. I just felt like just the conversation that I certainly had with the lads. Talking to you now, I can see now you would have fitted into that band a lot better, even after my conversations with the Cradle guys, because they were more. How can I put it? It felt like as though the band was far more laid back. Those two bands are far more laid back than what was going on in Cradle.
Oh yeah, totally. Worlds apart. I mean, they've all got shared history, with Academy Studios and recording. And like one thing I clearly remember when we were recording Vampire, and of course Academy was also where Cradle recorded the first album. But being in there with Keith Appleton, the studio owner, and Mags, the producer, and just thinking, Paradise Lost did Gothic in here, and realizing that the big instrumental break in the middle of Gothic, Keith, that was all his work, sort of thing, and so it was a real. Point being that everybody in Cradle really liked Paradise Lost, even though there weren't that many years between them. When you're younger, 1 or 2 years feels like longer, if you see what I mean. So Paradise Lost.
We measure things in decades now.
Yeah, exactly. But so Paradise Lost felt like this established band at that time, which they were, I mean, sort of, where would they have been up to then? I suppose Icon would have been out by that point. Because in fact, they would have been working on, where are we now? Yeah, so Draconian Times would have been in the works while we were recording Vampire, so yeah, and that was Paradise Lost big break,
Yeah. I'll just talk about My Dying Bride for a sec. I remember I said to Andrew, because he always reminded me of I call him the pedestrian Adrian Smith, and I think he laughed for about 10 or 15 seconds when I said that to him, because he's so, that slow sustain that he uses, backed by the keyboards in the band there, and just with the way the vocal just soars over the top as well. It's just magnificent what that band's been able to achieve, I think, with Aaron's vocal. As well. But man, I can definitely see you sort of having a career in those bands if that's what you decided to do. So it was just a case that you said, no, I've done that. I'm going to move on to other things. And I mentioned your writing in Terrorizer. I certainly don't remember you as a writer in Terrorizer at the time, but that's because, I was young and you read these things and you move on to the next article and you're not paying attention to who's writing it. But I've found your articles since, and they're well written. Because you've been in a band, I think this is the key thing. You can relate to the people that you're doing the reviews for and sometimes interviewing. So there were 2 magazines that I listened to, or that I read. Got to say, Metal Maniacs was my number one by far, the American magazine. We used to get that here about 3 months after it was released in the States. Such was, this is well before the days of the internet I'm talking about. But I used to cycle between Terrorizer and Metal Maniacs, and I found that's all I needed back then, because I think I just missed out on the fanzine craze. There wasn't a whole bunch around, certainly in Australia, like there were there. But look, I'll ask you one more question about Cradle, and then I'll do a time check, okay? So I have heard nothing, and I've never asked a question about Sarah. Sarah Jezebel Deva, I think, is her pseudonym or stage name. Was she a crucial contributor on Dusk?
Excuse me. Well, I think so, yeah. I mean, the vocals that she does, I think, are very important to the texture and the color of the album. And of course, she came out on tour with us and did that live, because had been a performer herself, on stage and studio, so she could do that. If she hadn't been around, no doubt somebody would have been recruited. Some session person would have been wheeled in to do it. But she was a character in her own right. She liked extreme metal. She did extreme metal projects of her own during and after Cradle. So, as I said, I don't think you could necessarily say pivotal, but she was part of, she was kind of like, we thought of her as part of the lineup, certainly when we were on tour. That's the way we tried to treat her. Well, I did anyway. And the fans certainly they knew that she wasn't, writing music, and she wasn't, she wasn't like a seventh member. There were 6 people in the photographs, put it that way. But yeah, she definitely had something to contribute. She wasn't just a voice, if you see what I mean. So,
I understand.
And she was like an impressive kind of Amazonian type, physical presence. She wasn't some sort of like little waif that would disappear. So yeah, when it worked in the band, having her there, I think it was good. I think it was really good to have her on stage, particularly as a presence and a voice, and to be able to recreate a little bit more of the album as it actually sounded. But of course, she got, as we all did, ended up getting on better with some people rather than others, and she wasn't immune to arguments and disputes and bad-tempered outbursts and whatnot. So, but yeah, I think she was an important part of that period for sure.
So there you have it, my conversation with former Cradle of Filth keyboard player Damien Gregori, aka Damien, but his real name, of course, is Greg Moffitt. If you like that conversation with a former member of Cradle of Filth, I've conducted chats with Dani Filth, Richard Shaw, Lindsay Schoolcraft, Nick Barker, Stuart Anstis, and Paula Lender, and all can be easily found either right here on YouTube. Well, the majority of them are on YouTube, but they are all definitely over at scarsandguitars.com. Hit the podcast tab and then search via the Whooshka widget. And whilst you're there, check out well over 550 conversations with the leading lights from hard rock, heavy metal, extreme metal, and beyond. Whilst you're here on YouTube, if you could like, subscribe, and share, that'd be fantastic. But even better, if you could leave a comment, I'd appreciate it. My name's Andrew Mackay-Smith, and I'm the host of the Scars and Guitars podcast series. It's goodbye for now.